Hello, welcome back to zzScience. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with an animal that most people think they understand, but probably don't. Not really. The version of this animal that lives in movies, in old stories, in the corners of folklore, that version is loud, dangerous, always on the edge of doing something terrible. Always teeth and shadow and drama. But the real animal is something else entirely. The real animal spends most of its life doing something that would look, to an outside observer, almost boring. Walking, resting, sitting in the snow and watching the tree line, sleeping curled against another warm body while the temperature drops somewhere below what you or I would find comfortable. The real animal lives quietly, moves quietly, and fits into its landscape so naturally that it can be standing 40 feet from you in a forest and you would never know. Tonight, we're going to follow the wolf. Not in the way nature documentaries usually do. Not with chase sequences and dramatic string music. Just slowly. At the pace they actually move, which is, most of the time, a pace that would not alarm a sleeping person. So get comfortable. Let the light in your room go soft. We're going in quietly. There's a particular sound that happens when a wolf places its paw down in deep snow. Or rather, there isn't a sound. That's the thing. You expect something. A crunch, maybe, or a soft compression, the way your own boot sounds when you step outside on a winter morning. But the wolf's foot comes down, and nothing happens. Or almost nothing. A faint settling. A whisper of contact so brief and so distributed that the snow barely registers it. This is not an accident. The wolf's paw is one of the more quietly extraordinary pieces of biological engineering in the northern landscape. It's large, much larger than you might expect if you've only seen wolves in photographs where scale is hard to judge. The forepaws especially. They can measure 5 inches across, sometimes more in the bigger northern subspecies. And that size matters because of something very simple: surface area. A larger foot spreads the animal's weight across more snow, the same principle that makes snowshoes work for humans. The wolf figured this out, or rather, evolution figured it out over tens of thousands of years, long before humans thought to strap wooden frames to their boots. But the size alone doesn't explain the silence. Look more closely at the paw, and you find something else. The toes can spread. They splay outward when the foot comes down, increasing that surface area even further. And when they spread, they reveal a webbing of skin connecting them. Not as dramatic as a duck's foot, nothing like that, but present, subtle. Enough to help distribute the load, enough to give a bit of purchase in soft conditions without punching straight down into the snowpack. And then there's the fur. Between the toes, woven into the spaces between those thick digital pads, there is dense protective fur. It traps air, it insulates. It also, and this is the part that seems almost designed for stealth, though of course it wasn't designed, just selected for, over time. It muffles. The contact between foot and ground goes through layers of fur before it even reaches the pad. And that matters when you're an animal trying to move without advertising yourself to the landscape. The pads themselves are tough, thick-skinned in a way that doesn't quite translate into human terms. But try to imagine the sole of a foot that has spent years, every year, walking on frozen ground, ice, rock, hard-packed snow. The pads develop a leathery quality. They crack sometimes, in extreme cold, which is one of the small difficulties of wolf life that doesn't get discussed much. But they also develop a kind of gripping texture, almost like the tread on a tire, but organic, irregular, worn into use. There's a circulatory adaptation in there too, which is worth mentioning just because it's quietly remarkable. Wolves have a countercurrent heat exchange system in their legs. Blood flowing down from the warm core of the body to the extremities passes close to blood flowing back up from the cold feet, and the two exchange heat. The warm blood heading down gives some of its warmth to the cold blood heading back up, which keeps the core from being robbed of heat, and it also means the feet themselves are kept at a temperature just above freezing. Cold enough to not waste the body's energy budget, warm enough to stay functional. It's an elegant solution, the kind of thing that, when you learn about it, makes you sit quietly for a moment and think about how much invisible engineering is running underneath every living thing that walks in the cold. So the wolf moves silently, but where is it going and how fast? This is where the reality of wolf life starts to diverge from the dramatic version. People imagine wolves as creatures in constant motion, always covering ground, always in pursuit of something. The image is one of relentless forward momentum, and it's true that wolves are capable of tremendous distances. A healthy adult wolf, motivated, not stopping, can cover 50 or 60 miles in a single day. There are documented cases of dispersing wolves, young animals leaving their birth pack to find new territory, traveling hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. One wolf, a male collared in Yellowstone, covered something like 1,000 miles before finding a mate. The distances are real, but capability and habit are different things. For most of their lives, wolves do not travel at that intensity. The 50-mile days are exceptional. The everyday reality is something much quieter. A wolf on a typical day in a stable territory, with a functioning family unit, with food available. That wolf might travel 5 miles, maybe 8, moving at a pace between a walk and a slow trot, stopping often, standing in one spot for long periods, nose working, ears rotating, eyes scanning. The researchers who study wolf movement patterns talk about something called the travel pace, which is the average speed at which a wolf moves when it is moving. Not sprinting, not sleeping, just going somewhere. That pace is around 5 miles per hour, which is fast for a human. You'd be working at that speed, your breathing would change, you'd feel it in your legs after a while. But for a wolf, it's an easy, sustainable rhythm. The gait at that speed is a trot, that diagonal leg movement where the front left and rear right move together, then front right and rear left. Efficient, low impact. The kind of movement that can be sustained for a very long time without metabolic cost. Watch a wolf trotting in footage, and there's something almost meditative about it. The head doesn't bob much. The back stays level. The whole animal moves as a single smooth unit, like something on rails, like the ground under it is. Simply happening without friction. And then it stops. Because wolves stop a lot. They stand, they sit, they lie down in the snow and watch. Just watch. For stretches of time that would be long even by human sitting still standards. Minutes, sometimes much longer. The territory itself is worth understanding because it shapes everything about how a wolf spends its time. A wolf pack's territory, and we'll get into what a pack actually is in more detail later, is not small. In North America, depending on the prey base and the density of competing packs, a territory might be anywhere from 50 square miles to 500 square miles. Some territories in the more remote northern regions are even larger. These are not ranges that get traversed in a day. They are spaces that get known over years, walked in segments, memorized in the way a person might memorize a landscape they've lived beside for their whole life. There's a core area within the territory that gets used more heavily. This is where the den is in the breeding season, where the pups are raised, where the pack sleeps most reliably. The rest of the territory gets patrolled, visited, scent marked, monitored, but not uniformly, not constantly. The pack moves through its landscape in patterns that respond to season, to prey movement, to weather, to the presence or absence of neighboring packs. And here's a thing about territories that becomes interesting when you sit with it: the borders. Wolf territories don't have fences. The borders are maintained through scent marking, urine, glandular secretions left on raised objects like stumps and rocks and tufts of vegetation, and through howling, which we'll come to later. The borders shift, sometimes. They compress in hard winters when prey is scarce. They expand in good years. They're contested, occasionally, by neighboring packs testing the edges. But mostly, the borders are respected. The scent posts say, "This place is occupied," and the neighboring pack, smelling that message, understands it and stays on its side. What this means in practical terms is that wolf travel is not random wandering. It's purposeful in a way that has a kind of territorial logic. Moving through the core area to check on the pups, or rendezvous with pack members who've been away. Drifting out along a familiar drainage or ridge to scent mark the periphery. Following a prey trail that leads through the middle territory. Returning to a kill site that still has food on it. The landscape is known. Each wolf in a pack has walked the same ground hundreds of times. They know where the ridge breaks toward the valley. They know which stream crossing is safe in high water. They know the rocky outcrops where they like to rest because the sun hits them in the afternoon. It's a kind of spatial knowledge that's hard to overstate. The territory is not just a place to move through, it's something more like home. Let's talk about rest, because this is probably the most underrepresented part of wolf life in everything you've ever seen about them. Wolves rest a lot. This sounds like a surprising statement, but it shouldn't be really. They're a large mammal. Large mammals have large energy requirements. Large energy requirements, when food is intermittent and calorie-intensive prey doesn't present itself every day, means that conservation of energy is important. You don't spend calories you don't have to spend. You rest when you can. Studies using GPS collars have allowed researchers to track wolf movement and inactivity simultaneously. And what the data shows is that wolves spend between 8 and 12 hours a day resting, some days more. In deep winter, when the cold is significant and energy is precious, resting time can extend even further. The body becomes conservative. The metabolism idles. Think about that for a moment. 12 hours of rest. That's half a day. A wolf who lives to be 8 years old, which is a reasonably good lifespan in the wild, will have spent 4 of those years lying down somewhere in the snow or forest or summer meadow, sleeping or drowsing or simply watching the world with calm, amber eyes. The resting behavior itself is interesting because it changes with weather and season and social context. In summer, wolves will often spread out when they rest. You'll see them lying apart from each other, sometimes at distances of 20 or 30 feet, managing body temperature by keeping air moving around them. In winter, the pattern reverses. They compress. They press against each other, fitting bodies to bodies in a way that minimizes exposed surface area and maximizes shared warmth. A sleeping wolf in winter does something that looks almost cozy, which is a word you don't often see in wildlife biology, but which is accurate here. It curls. The tail comes around, covering the nose and the face, the most thermally sensitive exposed area. The legs tuck underneath. The head rests on the flank of a packmate. The whole animal becomes a smaller, tighter, more efficient shape. losing heat more slowly to the air that might be, at that moment, 30 below. The position is so effective at heat retention that researchers studying wolves can sometimes identify resting spots in snow long after the wolves have moved on. Perfect oval depressions where the body heat has melted a thin layer of snow, refrozen into a faint glaze. Little sculptures of absence. A wolf was here. There's a question worth sitting with. What does a wolf experience during those hours of rest? We can't know, of course. That's the honest answer. We can observe behavior, measure physiology, make inferences from the data we have. But the interior experience of another animal is genuinely inaccessible to us. Anyone who tells you definitively what a wolf is thinking or feeling is making something up. But we know a few things. We know wolves dream. Or at least, we know that during sleep, the brains of dogs, which are behaviorally and neurologically so close to wolves that the data is reasonably transferable, show the same patterns of slow-wave sleep and REM sleep that humans show. And during REM sleep, they show the twitching, leg movements, and vocalizations that indicate active dreaming. The sleeping dog that runs in place or lets out soft, muffled sounds, that's REM sleep. That's dreaming. Wolves almost certainly do the same. What does a wolf dream about? Running, perhaps. The smell of a particular hillside. The sound of a howl from far away. We have no idea, really. But the fact that they dream at all is something. It means their sleep is not simple unconsciousness. It's a richer state than that. We also know that wolves are alert sleepers by necessity. A pack resting in the open is a pack that could be approached by neighboring wolves, by bears, by all the various pressures of the wild world. So rest is never total. It is more like a dial turned down than a switch turned off. The ears still rotate during rest, tracking sounds. The nose still works. A wolf can go from fully asleep to standing and alert in a second or two, if the right stimulus reaches it. That speed of arousal is an adaptation, obviously. But it also means that the resting wolf lives in a kind of liminal state, not quite absent from the world, even when it's most still. There is something about a winter forest at night that resists description. Not because it's too beautiful to put into words, though it might be that too, but because the most defining quality of it is the thing that words are worst at conveying: silence. The specific quality of winter forest silence, which is different from summer silence, different from desert silence, different from any other quiet. It has a weight to it. Something to do with the sound-absorbing quality of deep snowpack, which is extraordinary. Fresh fallen snow can absorb up to 40% of sound energy passing through it. The forest at night in winter is not just quiet, it is actively damped, soundproofed by the landscape itself. And into this silence, a wolf pack moves. Imagine it. The pale light of a three-quarter moon filtering through snow-laden fir branches and hitting the ground in irregular silver patches. Somewhere in that light, 4 or 5 wolves, a family, traveling together the way families do. Moving at that 5-mile-per-hour trot, almost no sound, just the faint compression of paw on snow, repeated, steady, and even that disappearing quickly into the dampened air. The trees are very tall here. They've been here a long time. Much longer than the wolves, in the sense of individual years. The firs and spruces in an old-growth northern forest can be hundreds of years old. Their trunks are massive and grey and still. Lichen clings to the bark in patches, grey-green, patient, growing a millimetre a year. Somewhere up in the canopy, invisible, A great horned owl has been sitting since before the sun went down, and it watches the wolves pass below without particular interest. The wolves don't look up. They know the owl is there, probably. Their senses are acute enough that they have a comprehensive awareness of their surroundings that we can barely imagine. But the owl is not relevant to what they're doing tonight. They are, as best we can determine from the research on wolf movement patterns, traveling along a familiar route toward a particular destination. Maybe a meadow at the far end of their range. Maybe a river crossing they use regularly. Maybe they have no specific destination at all, just moving through their space, the way you might take an evening walk on a familiar route. Not going anywhere, just going. Let's slow down even further and look at how that movement actually happens. Not the pace or the direction, but the mechanics of it. The physics of a wolf moving through winter. When a wolf trots across open snow, its tracks form a pattern that wildlife trackers have studied carefully. The feet land in what's called a direct register, meaning the hind foot comes down in the same spot where the front foot just was, so that each step uses the depression already made rather than punching a new hole in the snow. This is more efficient for obvious reasons. Breaking through a crust of snow takes energy. If the front foot has already done that work, the hind foot just steps into the ready-made hole. The track pattern for a trotting wolf looks almost like a single line of footprints, rather than the paired left-right pattern you might expect. Biologists call this perfect direct register. It's so precise, so consistent, that the wolf leaves what looks like the trail of a single-legged animal. One print after another in an almost perfectly straight line, with very little lateral weaving. There are practical reasons for this beyond energy efficiency. In deep snow, breaking a new hole with every step is exhausting. Walking in single file, which wolf packs actually do, with each animal following the prints of the one ahead, using that already broken path, reduces the total energy spent by the pack dramatically. The lead wolf does the hard work. The others follow in those steps, conserving energy for later. The lead position rotates, usually. The pack doesn't have a permanent trail breaker. They share the work in a way that, if you described it to a human child, without telling them it was wolves, they might think sounded cooperative and fair. Which it is, just not consciously fair. Just a behavioral pattern that has emerged because it works. There's a wolf researcher named David Meck, L. David Meck, actually, often just called Dave Meck in the literature, who has been studying wolves for something approaching 60 years. He started in the early 1960s in Isle Royale National Park, a remote island in Lake Superior, tracking the wolves there. He's been doing some version of this ever since. He's published dozens of papers, several books, and he is largely responsible for much of what modern science understands about wolf behavior. He's also responsible for something that took real intellectual honesty to do, correcting his own earlier work. In 1970, Meck published a book called The Wolf that introduced, among other things, the concept of the alpha wolf. He drew partly on earlier captive studies by a researcher named Rudolf Schenkel, who had observed wolves in a zoo setting and documented the dominance hierarchies that developed there. The concept became enormously popular. The alpha wolf entered the culture. Everyone knew about alpha wolves. The problem was that the captive wolf studies were studying an artificial situation. Putting unrelated wolves together in an enclosure produces real dominance behavior. It does. Stressed animals competing for limited resources in an unfamiliar group show aggression and hierarchy. That's real. But it's not what happens in the wild, among natural wolf packs. What Mech found, over decades of studying wolves in their actual habitat, was that natural wolf packs are almost invariably families. A breeding pair, the parents, and their offspring from the current year and possibly one or two previous years. The parents are dominant, not because they won some alpha competition, but because they're the parents. They're the ones who know the territory, who have the experience, who have the relationships. Their offspring follow their lead, the way pups and juveniles naturally follow parents. By 2000, Mech had essentially spent a decade walking back the alpha wolf concept in paper after paper. He asked his publisher to stop printing the 1970 book because he felt it was doing more harm than good by spreading the alpha concept. He wrote a 1999 paper with the explicit title, Alpha Status, Dominance, and Division of Labor in Wolf Packs, that laid out very plainly why the alpha model didn't fit what he observed. The real wolf pack, he wrote, is best understood as a nuclear family. And nuclear families don't have alpha members, they have parents. This detail, which we'll come back to in much more depth, shapes everything about how you understand wolf resting, wolf travel, wolf communication. Because if it's a family, then the warmth of 20 wolves sleeping together isn't political dominance being demonstrated. It's just family members keeping each other warm, which is a very different thing. Let's go back to the movement for a moment, because there's something in it that I find genuinely worth sitting with. A wolf traveling through its territory in winter is, by any measure, an animal that belongs to its landscape in a way that's hard to find an equivalent for. There's a word that gets used in ecology, keystone species, for animals whose presence shapes the ecosystem around them in disproportionate ways. Wolves are the canonical example. The return of wolves to Yellowstone in 1995 changed the park in ways that went far beyond wolf, deer, elk interactions. Changed where certain animals grazed, changed the vegetation, changed stream banks. Eventually, and this is the part that sounds impossible until you follow the chain of effects, changed the behavior of rivers. But I don't want to talk about that tonight. Not because it isn't remarkable, it is, but because it's another form of the dramatic wolf narrative. The wolf as transformer, the wolf as force. Tonight, the wolf is just walking through the snow, moving through a world it knows well, at a pace it has used 10,000 times before. The paws coming down, spreading, pushing off. The breath visible in the cold air, small clouds of moisture condensing and dispersing. The nose working constantly, tasting the air, reading the chemical text of who and what has passed this way recently. And the world around it is very still. The stillness of a winter forest at 2 a.m. is something that humans rarely experience. Most of us are inside by then, surrounded by the ambient sounds of human structures, heating systems cycling on and off, traffic sounds in the distance, the hum of electricity in the walls. The insulation between us and real outdoor quiet is so complete that we've lost the sense of what true quiet sounds like. But a wolf at 2 a.m, moving through a forest where the nearest road is 20 miles away. That animal is in a silence that is almost incomprehensible by modern human standards. The only sounds are the sounds of the world itself. Wind through branches, somewhere far away. The creak of a tree trunk cooling in the night. The occasional rustle from something small in the underbrush. A mouse under the snow. A ptarmigan tucked into a spruce. And the breathing of the pack. That breathing. Multiple bodies, warm, rhythmic. The exhale visible as vapor in the cold air. There's something about that, the shared rhythm of multiple creatures breathing together in the dark, that works on the nervous system in a particular way. Even just thinking about it, or trying to, tends to slow things down. The wolf's nose is worth dwelling on, because it is, in terms of raw sensory capability, one of the most extraordinary things in the natural world. A human nose has roughly 5 to 6 million olfactory receptors. A wolf has somewhere between 150 and 300 million. Not just more receptors, also a larger proportion of brain devoted to processing olfactory information. The part of the brain that handles smell is, proportionally, 14 times larger in a wolf than in a human. What this means in practical terms is difficult to translate across species. But researchers have tried to give us handles for it. A wolf can detect certain scents at concentrations 100,000 times lower than a human can. It can smell a single drop of blood diluted in an Olympic swimming pool. It can track a trail of footprints through snow days after the animal that made them has passed through, reading from the residual scent, not just that an animal was here, but something about the animal's health, its stress level, whether it was a familiar individual or a stranger, whether it was moving fast or slow. The wolf's experience of moving through its territory is not primarily a visual experience, the way our experience of moving through space is. It is primarily an olfactory one. The forest, for a wolf, is a document. Every scent mark, every scrape, every track that carries residual smell is information. The pack reads this as it moves. They know which neighboring wolves have been testing the borders. They know whether the pack that holds the adjacent territory has been by recently. They know where a moose has been bedded, where a small deer crossed the trail, where another predator, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, has been moving. And into this richly annotated landscape they move quietly, processing, updating their understanding of the world around them with every step. There is a moment that wildlife photographers and wolf researchers have described, sometimes that I want to try to convey. It's a moment that doesn't have a name, as far as I know. It should. The moment is this. You are in the field, in winter, and you have been watching a wolf pack resting at some distance. They've been lying in the snow, in a loose cluster, for an hour or more. You've been watching through binoculars or a spotting scope, trying not to move, trying to keep your own breathing slow and your presence minimal. And then, at some point, one of the wolves raises its head. Just raises its head, not in alarm. You can read alarm in a wolf's posture very clearly, and this isn't that. The ears are up but relaxed. The body hasn't moved. The eyes are open and calm. The wolf is simply awake, where a moment ago it was asleep. Just like that. It looks around, not urgently, methodically. Its head turns slowly, scanning the visible landscape, and then it stops. On something you can't see. A smell maybe. A sound. Something its senses have registered that yours haven't. It holds that position for a moment, evaluating. And then, satisfied, it puts its head back down, goes back to sleep. That's it. That's the moment. The ease of it is what strikes people who see it. The complete absence of drama. The wolf was awake, checked the world, found it acceptable, and returned to rest. No fuss, no lingering alertness, just a smooth, efficient cycle from rest to attention to rest again, taking maybe 30 seconds. Wolves do this regularly, multiple times during a resting period, different animals taking their turn at this ambient monitoring. It's not organized, it's not assigned, it just happens. The way a family group of any kind tends to naturally produce some awareness of the environment, even when most members are resting. Someone is always, at some level, paying attention. One more thing about wolf anatomy before we move on, because it's relevant to the silence of their movement, and I want to make sure we've given it its due. The wolf's stride length and its gait efficiency are the product of a body plan that's been refined over a very long evolutionary history. The wolf belongs to the genus Canis, but the lineage that led to modern wolves goes back much further. Through millions of years of carnivore evolution in North America and Eurasia, producing bodies that are, by any engineering measure, extremely efficient locomotion platforms. The legs are long relative to body size. This increases stride length, which means fewer strides per mile, which means less energy expended. The chest is narrow. Wolves are not barrel-chested the way some dogs are. When you look at a wolf head-on, the front legs are very close together, the narrow chest allowing them to move almost in a single plane, rather than spreading wide. This means, when the wolf trots, that the hind foot can step into the print of the front foot more precisely, that direct register we talked about, because the front foot was right in the midline to begin with. The musculature is lean, not the bulging muscle of a sprinting animal. Wolf muscle is more like marathon runner muscle, designed for endurance, for efficiency at moderate speeds over long distances, rather than explosive short-distance power. The sprinting wolves can do, and they can sprint at speeds approaching 38 miles per hour, is not their preferred mode. It's for specific situations. The preferred mode is the easy trot, the sustainable pace, the movement that can go on for hours without the animal showing particular fatigue. And all of this in a body that, depending on the subspecies and the individual, weighs somewhere between 60 and 130 pounds. Not enormous, not tiny. Roughly the size of a large dog, which of course makes sense given what dogs are. But there's a quality in how a wolf carries that weight that's hard to describe and immediately recognizable to anyone who has seen wolves in person. Something in the movement that's economical in a very particular way. Nothing wasted, no excess, every motion serving a purpose. The nights get long in the places wolves live. In northern Canada, in the depth of winter, the sun might be above the horizon for only 6 hours. In some parts of Alaska, even less. The remaining 18 hours are dark, or in the pale near dark of moonlight on snow, which has its own quality. Bright enough to see by, dim enough that shadows are deep and the world has edges. The wolves are active across this entire cycle, day and night, though they tend toward peaks of activity around dawn and dusk, the crepuscular pattern shared by many predators. Late morning they often rest. Deep in the night they may rest as well. But they're not committed to a schedule the way humans are. They move when they have reason to move. They rest when they can. In those long winter nights, the pack might do something that looks, from the outside, like almost nothing. A group of animals lying in the snow, breathing slowly, occasionally shifting position, one raising its head to check the air and then settling back down. The stars very bright above them, the kind of bright that only happens when there's no light pollution and the air is very cold and clear. The Milky Way actually visible, actually overhead, a smear of light across the dark. The wolves don't notice the stars, as far as we know. They live in a world of scent and sound rather than distant light. But they are part of that landscape just as completely as the stars overhead, or the old fir trees around them, or the snow under their bodies. There is something about imagining them there, perfectly placed in that silence, warm against each other, resting, that is deeply settling. Here on zzScience, we try to bring you into these spaces gently, Not the spaces that make you feel small or overwhelmed, but the spaces that remind you that the world is very large and very old, and that most of what happens in it is quiet. Most of the wild world is not drama. It is patience. It is rest. It is waiting and listening and moving slowly, and knowing your territory well enough that you don't have to think too hard about where you're going. The wolf knows its territory well enough to move through it in complete darkness, at 2 in the morning, in the deep middle of winter, and find what it needs. That knowledge, accumulated over years of walking the same ground, is a kind of security, a deep familiarity with the world you inhabit, which is something most of us are looking for in one form or another. Let's pull back a little and look at the larger context of wolf life, the rhythms that play out over months and seasons rather than nights and days. Winter is a particular kind of time for wolves. It's the season when food is hardest to get, or should be by intuition, because prey is scarce and the cold is extreme and travel is hard. But it's also, oddly, the season when prey is most vulnerable. Deep snow tires ungulates. Moose and deer and elk that summer easily in the open have to spend enormous energy just moving in winter conditions. They're burning reserves. They're weaker than they were in August. The old, the sick, the injured, the animals who are already at the edge of survival, become more accessible to predators in winter than they were in summer. This doesn't make it easy. It never is. But it's one of the seasonal rhythms that shapes wolf life. Winter as the time of greatest challenge and also greatest opportunity simultaneously. Spring comes and the landscape changes in ways that matter enormously to the pack. This is breeding season, typically February and March, and it's the time when the sleeping den is chosen, when the female becomes larger and slower, when the pack begins to orient around a particular place rather than the broad range of winter travel. The territory suddenly has a center of gravity. And then the pups are born, somewhere between 4 and 6 on average, though litters of 8 or 9 are possible. Born blind, born deaf, born completely dependent on warmth and milk and the protection of the den. At this point, the pack's energy, which had been spread across the territory, focuses. Adults who aren't the mother provision the den, bringing food, sometimes carrying it in their stomachs and regurgitating it, which sounds unpleasant, but is an efficient way to transport nutrients across a large territory. The pups grow fast. Within 2 weeks, their eyes open. Within a month, they're at the den entrance, watching the world with that slightly startled, large-eared look that all young canines have. We'll come to the family structure in much more depth. That's where the real center of wolf life is, the bonds and the belonging and the social warmth of it. But for now, the night is getting later, or maybe you're already very drowsy, which is exactly the right state for where we are. The pack is somewhere in the forest, in the snow, moving or resting or somewhere between, wolves in that light sleep state, ears slowly tracking the sounds of the night, the nose still working even in rest, the body warm, the breath slow. The temperature outside is probably somewhere around 15 below. The snow has a crust on it from yesterday's brief warm spell and refreezing last night, and it reflects the moonlight back up in a soft, diffused glow. The trees are still. No wind. The silence is the deepest kind. The kind that isn't really absence of sound, but is itself a presence, a texture, something you can feel at the back of your throat. The wolves breathe together. Their bodies are warm against each other. Their paws are tucked under them or stretched out in the snow. The dense toe fur keeping the pads from the worst of the cold. They're resting well tonight. There are no pressures immediately at hand, no neighboring pack encroaching, no competing sound on the wind to bring them alert. The world, as they can read it with those extraordinary senses, is quiet. Just this: the forest, the snow, the cold air, and the pack, resting together. There's no hurry. The night is long. There's a particular kind of relationship that's hard to describe without making it sound either too simple or too sentimental. The relationship between parents and their young, and between siblings who have grown up in the same small world, in the same cold, eating the same food, learning the same landscape. It's not complicated. It doesn't need to be. It just is what it is. This quiet, constant gravity between individuals who know each other completely and have never known anything else. That's a wolf pack. Not a ranked military unit. Not a hierarchy of dominance held together by aggression and submission. Just a family. A breeding pair and their offspring most of the time. Sometimes an older sibling from a previous year who hasn't yet dispersed to find its own territory and mate. Sometimes a grandparent, in packs where conditions have been favorable and multiple generations overlap. But the core of it, always, is a pair of parents and their children. This sounds almost too simple once you say it out loud. And in a way, that simplicity is the point. The wolf pack is not a complicated political structure. It's what you get when two animals mate, raise offspring together year after year, and those offspring stay close to their parents for 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 years before eventually moving on. Family, just family, with all the warmth and friction and casual intimacy that family implies. Let's go back to the science of this for a moment, because it matters that this isn't just a gentle reframing. It's what the data actually shows. David Mech, who we mentioned briefly in part 1, spent years correcting the narrative he had inadvertently helped create. His research in Yellowstone and in the Canadian Arctic, particularly on Ellesmere Island, where he studied a pack over many seasons, consistently showed the same thing. The wolves weren't a dominance hierarchy, they were a family. The dominant pair weren't dominant because they'd won fights. They were the parents. They were older. They were experienced. Their offspring deferred to them not out of fear, but out of the same dynamic that makes young animals of most species naturally follow and defer to parents who have information they don't yet have. A yearling wolf doesn't yet know this territory. It doesn't know where the prey is in different seasons, where the dangerous crossings are, where the neighboring pack's scent marks are. The parents know, so the yearling follows, which looks, from the outside, like deference to authority. But it's really just common sense. It's learning. Mech noted something that he found genuinely striking. In natural packs, he rarely observed aggressive dominance behavior between adults. The snarling, the pinning, the submission postures that had been so dramatic in the captive studies. He saw them occasionally, but they were not the organizing principle. What he saw more often was cooperation, coordination, the quiet efficiency of a family group that has worked out its rhythms over time. There's a term in animal behavior called affiliative behavior, basically the friendly stuff. Grooming, playing, resting together, touching. And in natural wolf packs, affiliative behavior is far more common than agonistic behavior, the aggressive, dominance-asserting stuff. The pack spends much more time being nice to each other, in the biological sense of the word, than being threatening to each other. Which also, when you think about it, makes complete sense. Aggression is metabolically expensive. It causes injuries. A pack whose members were constantly fighting would be an inefficient, injured, fragmented pack. Natural selection disfavors that. What gets selected for is a group dynamic that is cohesive, cooperative, and mostly calm. Picture the den site in late spring. It's a south-facing slope, probably, because south-facing slopes warm faster in spring, and the ground softens sooner, and a den dug into a south-facing hillside benefits from that sun. The entrance is low, maybe 18 inches across, not particularly obvious from a distance. The mother has chosen this site carefully, or perhaps used a site the family has used before, because suitable den sites get reused across years. The ground inside is dry and packed, and smells deeply of wolf, of generations of use. The pups are 5 weeks old now. They can hear. They can see. They have grown from the blind, round-headed, slightly helpless creatures they were at birth into something much more recognizable. Small wolves, essentially, with enormous ears relative to their heads and enormous paws relative to their bodies, and an energy level that seems, in comparison to the adults, almost comically excessive. They play constantly. Not in the way human children have scheduled play. They play continuously, in the gaps between eating and sleeping, which is basically all the time. They wrestle, they chase each other, they carry sticks and drop them and chase them again. They ambush their siblings from behind tufts of grass with a stalking behavior that already looks very much like the hunting behavior of adults, though they have no prey and no particular purpose, and the hunt always ends in a tumble and a brief, energetic bite fight before everyone calms down and wanders off. The adult pack members who are not the mother, the father, the yearlings if there are any, interact with the pups in ways that are consistently gentle, genuinely, observably gentle. Adults who walk near the den entrance will often stop and allow the pups to mob them, climbing on them, biting at their muzzles, pulling at their ears. The adults tolerate this with what can only be described as patience. They may nudge a pup gently away if the biting gets too enthusiastic. They may pin one briefly and clean it, lick its face and ears and underside with a thoroughness that the pup often tries to wriggle out of. But they don't. Frighten the pups. There's no correction through aggression. The tone at the den during these interactions is one of warmth. The muzzle lick. This is one of the more quietly significant behaviors in wolf social life, and it doesn't get quite the attention it deserves. When a wolf returns to the pack after an absence, even a relatively brief one, even just a few hours of separation, the reunion involves a behavior where the returning wolf approaches with its tail raised and gets immediately mobbed by the rest of the pack, who press against it and lick at its muzzle. Specifically the muzzle, the corners of the mouth. This behavior has multiple functions layered into it. It originated evolutionarily from a pup behavior. Young pups lick the muzzle of an adult to trigger regurgitation, to get the adult to bring up food that the pup can eat. This is a common mechanism in carnivores with pups too young to eat whole prey. The muzzle lick is a food solicitation. But in adult wolves, it's become something beyond that. It's a greeting, an affiliation marker, an expression of social bond. The behavior has been retained and repurposed into something that communicates relationship, closeness, belonging. When adults greet each other with muzzle licks, there is no food being solicited. The communication is something more like, "I know you. You are part of my world. I'm glad you're here." Which is, when you follow the behavioral history of it back through its origins in pup food begging, kind of moving in a dry, biological way. A behavior that started as, "Please feed me," became, over evolutionary time, "I am glad to see you." Need becoming affection. Dependency becoming bond. Wolf pups do this constantly. They mob every adult who approaches the den, pressing and licking and wriggling with an enthusiasm that is exhausting to watch. Adults do it more selectively, more quietly. A returning adult standing at the edge of the pack group and the animals nearest to it, leaning in to touch their noses to its muzzle, briefly, gently. It's quiet and quick. A few seconds, but it happens every time. Greetings are not taken for granted. Let's talk about how wolves communicate more broadly, because it's one of the areas where the reality of their social life is most different from popular understanding. The version of wolf communication that most people know is the howl. We'll spend real time on howling in part 3, the acoustics of it, the distances it carries, what it actually means. But the howl is, relatively speaking, the loudest and least frequent form of wolf communication. Most of what wolves say to each other happens quietly. Body language is probably the primary medium. Wolves are extraordinarily fluent readers of posture, movement, ear position, tail position, facial expression. These signals are subtle enough that human observers, even trained ones, can miss them. But they are constant and precise. A wolf approaching another wolf communicates its intent and mood through how it carries its tail. High and stiff says one thing, low and tucked says another. Horizontal and relaxed says a third. Through whether it makes direct eye contact or averts its gaze, through the position of its ears, forward and alert or flattened back, through whether it approaches directly or in an arc, through the height at which it carries its head. These signals are being read and responded to continuously. Two wolves within sight of each other are in a constant low-bandwidth conversation that never stops. A raised tail from one animal causes a subtle response in the other. A slow turn of the head changes the information the first animal receives and possibly causes it to adjust its own signaling. It's a dialogue, just a wordless one. Or not wordless. Just using a vocabulary that operates below the threshold of sound. Scent marking adds another layer. Within the territory, the pack is constantly leaving and updating a chemical record of who has been where and when. Scent posts, particular stumps, rocks, grass tufts, tree bases, are visited regularly, sniffed thoroughly, and often marked over. Wolves mark by urinating on raised objects, by scraping the ground with their hind feet, leaving glandular secretions from interdigital glands, and by rubbing body parts containing scent glands against surfaces. The result is a territory that is, for wolves, saturated with information. Moving through it is like moving through a landscape covered in handwritten notes. Except the notes are three-dimensional and carry information about identity, health, reproductive state, and timing. And then there are the quieter vocalizations, not howls. Wolves have a whole range of sounds that are used at close range for close communication. Whines and whimpers, the high-pitched sounds that express distress, excitement, or solicitation. Used especially by pups, but also by adults in certain contexts. Growls of varying intensity and meaning. A low, rolling rumble that can mean several different things depending on context. Huffs, yips, a sort of low, conversational woo sound that seems to carry something like, I'm here, things are fine, carry on. None of these sounds are dramatic. Most of them, if you heard them without context, you might not even identify as wolf sounds. They're domestic. Small sounds for small distances, for the immediate circle of the pack. The howl carries for miles. These other sounds carry for feet. The resting behavior we looked at in part 1, the way wolves press together in cold weather, the way they sleep curled with tails over noses, has a social dimension beyond thermoregulation that's worth looking at more carefully. Physical contact between pack members during rest is not random. Animals choose who they sleep next to. The choice, across a pack, tends to reflect the affiliative bonds within the group. The animals who are closest, socially, tend to be the ones most frequently in physical contact during rest. This is consistent with what we know about social mammals generally. Physical proximity and touch are used to maintain and express social bonds. In wolves, the parents tend to rest together, and the pups of the year tend to be in close contact with their mother, especially when young. Yearlings are more variable, sometimes in close contact with parents, sometimes with siblings, sometimes more peripheral. The sleeping arrangement, taken as a picture across a season, is a kind of map of the social relationships in the pack. Touch between resting wolves is casual and constant. Not always the full-body press of deep cold. Often something smaller, a chin resting on a sibling's flank, a paw thrown over another animal's back, an adult idly licking a pup's ear during mutual rest. These small contacts are maintained even when the animals aren't fully asleep, and they seem to have a calming function. Wolves in physical contact with pack members show lower resting heart rates than isolated wolves, in the research that's been done on this. The touch itself is, biologically, something like reassurance, which is not surprising. It is an animal that has evolved in a social group. Isolation for a wolf is not a natural or comfortable state. Being surrounded by familiar others, being touched by familiar others, is the baseline of safety and comfort. The solitary wolf is either a disperser, a young animal in the stressful process of leaving and finding its own territory, or an animal that has suffered some loss. Full pack life, in the company of family, is where wolves function best. It's what they're built for. There's a quieter version of pack life that rarely makes it into the dramatic retelling. And it's the version that occupies most of the pack's time. The pack is resting. It's midday, midsummer, and the sun is warm enough that they've spread out a bit rather than pressing together. The mother is lying on her side in a patch of sunlight. Two pups are asleep against her, pressed into the warm curve of her belly. Two other pups are lying a few feet away, also asleep, legs occasionally twitching with whatever they're dreaming. The father is sitting upright at the edge of the group, not asleep, but in that low alert rest state, with half-closed eyes and slow breathing, watching the meadow, processing the air. A yearling, a young female born last spring, old enough now to be physically almost adult-sized, but still distinctly a juvenile in her behavior, approaches the father and sits beside him. Not requesting anything, not doing anything, just sitting beside him. The father doesn't react to her arrival much. A brief glance, a small tail wag, just a few beats, barely perceptible. And they sit there together, the two of them, watching the meadow. This is a lot of wolf life, just sitting together. Not doing anything in particular, being in the same space, comfortable with the presence of another. Watching the world go by at a slow pace. Wolves at rest are not tense. Their faces relax. The tension that you see in a wolf moving through uncertain terrain, that slightly forward lean, the intent gaze, the gathered readiness, it leaves during rest. And what remains is something that looks, in the honest light of comparison to other animals you've known, like ease. Like animals who are comfortable in their situation. There are things we observe in wolf packs that we don't have fully adequate language for. Behaviors that we can describe, but that resist clean categorization. One of them is what some researchers have called celebrations, which is a word that makes careful scientists uncomfortable because it implies an emotional experience they can't verify. But the behavior is real. and the word keeps getting used because nothing else quite fits. After a kill, or at certain reunion moments, or sometimes seemingly at random, wolf packs go into a brief, intense period of group excitement. They rush toward each other. They vocalize, a mix of howls and yips and the lower rumbles. They lick at each other's faces. They bump bodies. They run in short circles. They wag their tails with an energy that the rest of the time they reserve for specific social moments. And then, after a few minutes, it's over. They settle. They go back to their usual calm. What is happening in those moments? We don't know. The honest answer is, we don't know. Something is happening. Clearly, obviously, something that involves the animals being in a different affective state than their baseline. Something that looks, to an observer, like joy, like relief, like the specific feeling of being with your family after a time apart. Whether that's what it is, whether there's a subjective experience there that matches the behavioral description, is something we cannot verify from the outside. But the behavior is real, and it's soft enough and frequent enough that it shapes the texture of pack life in a way that matters. Let's think for a moment about what the pups are learning and how they're learning it. Wolf pups don't have a classroom. They don't have lessons. What they have is a few years of being embedded in a functioning family unit that moves through a landscape, and the learning happens through that embedding. Through watching and following and participating and making mistakes and adjusting. By the time a pup is 6 months old, it's traveling with the pack. Not to the same distances or at the same pace as the adults. They fall behind sometimes, and adults wait or circle back. But they're out in the territory. They're learning which trails the pack uses and where those trails lead. They're encountering the scent posts at the territory edges and learning to read them. They're seeing how the adults respond to different situations, how the parents handle an encounter with a black bear, which wolves do occasionally without major conflict. How they navigate a river crossing in spring flood. How they approach a potential prey animal. This is apprenticeship learning, essentially. Learning by doing, alongside more experienced practitioners. The same way that humans transmitted skills and knowledge before formal education existed. Not instruction, but immersion. The motor skills needed for hunting develop gradually and with a lot of failed attempts. A 6-month-old wolf pup stalking a mouse in a meadow is not particularly efficient at it. The stalking behavior is there, the creep, the freeze, the pounce. But the timing is off, the execution is clumsy, the mouse escapes more often than not. By 18 months, the same animal is noticeably more precise. By 3 years, it's a functional adult hunter with a developing set of skills. Watching pups practice on small prey, mice, voles, grasshoppers, sometimes just leaves blowing in the wind, is one of those things that tends to produce helpless affection in observers, regardless of their scientific training. The absolute seriousness with which a pup stalks a grasshopper, the focused, trembling freeze before the pounce, the complete indignity of the pounce itself when the grasshopper simply hops away. It's playing, but it's also practice. And the fact that it looks like fun doesn't mean it isn't also important work. There's something that happens between wolves during grooming that I want to describe carefully, because it's one of the more intimate and quiet parts of their social life, and it gets overlooked. Mutual grooming in wolves is less extensive than in primates. Wolves don't spend hours grooming each other the way monkeys do. But it happens, and it matters. It tends to happen during rest periods, and it tends to be initiated by one animal approaching another and either offering itself to be groomed, lying down, tilting the head to expose the neck, or beginning to lick the face or ears of the other animal. The areas that get most attention are the ones hardest for a wolf to groom itself: the neck, behind the ears, around the muzzle. The area inside the ears, which can accumulate dirt and parasites. The forehead, between the eyes. The groomer works slowly, methodically, their tongue moving in small strokes. The animal being groomed typically shows obvious physical relaxation, muscles releasing, head drooping slightly, eyes half closed. Sometimes it falls asleep during grooming. The functional reason for grooming is parasite removal, skin cleaning, wound inspection. These are real functions and they matter. But the social function, the bonding, the physical closeness, the calming effect, seems to be at least as important, possibly more so. Animals who engage in mutual grooming more frequently tend to have higher affiliative relationships on other measures. The grooming both reflects the bond and reinforces it. And it's quiet. That's the thing. It happens in silence mostly. The pack is resting. Two animals are near each other. One begins to groom the other. There's no vocalization, no ceremony. Just the slow, patient movement of a tongue over fur and the gradual relaxation of the animal receiving it. Something about the family structure of wolves that I find genuinely interesting. The way the older pups from previous years serve as helpers. In a successful pack, one where conditions have been good and offspring have survived to yearling age, there may be 1 or 2 yearlings present when the new litter is born. These yearlings are, biologically speaking, older siblings. They are not the parents, they are not the youngest, they are somewhere in the middle of this small family hierarchy. And they help. Actively, genuinely help. Yearlings babysit. When both parents need to travel or hunt, yearlings stay at or near the den and watch the pups. They play with the pups, patiently tolerating the mob of small bodies with more patience usually than you might expect from. Adolescent animals. They regurgitate food for pups. They will, if threatened, position themselves between pups and potential danger. None of this was taught to them, in any direct sense. There was no instruction. The behavior emerges from a combination of social bonding. These are their siblings, animals they've been in contact with since birth. Of hormonal context, the breeding season and pup-rearing period trigger care behaviors in social canids generally, and of the simple fact that they're present and the pups need care. This helper system has real effects on pup survival. Packs with yearlings present tend to successfully raise more pups to independence than pairs without helpers. The family structure, which extends beyond just the parents, turns out to be a genuine advantage. Having older siblings around matters. The children who stay close to home while they're still learning contribute something real. This is one of the more moving aspects of wolf social biology, if you let yourself sit with it. Not because it's unusual for social animals, cooperative breeding is found all over the animal kingdom, but because it maps so directly onto a human experience. The older sibling who steps up. The young aunt or uncle who becomes unexpectedly essential. The extended family that is more functional, more resilient than the nuclear unit alone. Winter again. The pack has been moving since before dawn. They covered a long loop through the northern part of their territory, following a frozen river for miles, cutting up through a dense spruce forest, emerging into an open burn area where the snow is deep and unbroken, and the travel is hard. They're returning now toward the core of the territory. The pace has slowed. The younger animals are visibly tired. Pups born last spring, now 7 or 8 months old, and traveling at full adult distances for the first time this season are showing the effort of it in small ways, moving more slowly, lagging a few paces behind the adults. One of them stops to lie down briefly in the snow before the father circles back and passes near it, and the pup gets up and follows. The sky is darkening, not just the early dark of winter afternoon, but actual incoming weather. Cloud building from the northwest, the air pressure dropping in the way that wolves can feel before humans can see it in the sky. A storm coming. Not tonight, probably. Tomorrow, maybe. But the air knows. The pack finds a familiar slope, south-facing, protected on one side by a dense windbreak of young spruce, and they settle. The adults lie down first. The pups follow, collapsing against the nearest adult bodies with the exhausted immediacy of young animals who have been too tired to sleep for the last hour, but kept moving anyway. There's a brief bout of face-licking as animals settle in. Quick greetings, quick reassurances. The tail wag energy is low tonight. Everyone is tired. The greetings are still exchanged, still honest, but subdued. A sniff of a familiar neck, a tongue across a familiar ear. The quiet acknowledgement. We are here. We made it. This is where we rest. And then the stillness. One by one, the animals slow their breathing. The pups fall asleep almost immediately. The deep, unconscious sleep of young animals who have used everything they had. The adults take a little longer. A few more scans of the tree line, a few more deep draws of air reading the evening. The father's eyes are the last to close, or nearly. He stays up a few minutes past the others, watching. Nothing is there. The forest is quiet. The air says the world is fine. He puts his head down. Belonging is a word that comes up when you try to describe what wolves have with each other and with their territory. It's not a scientific term, but it comes up anyway. The wolf belongs to its pack in a way that is foundational to its biology. It is not merely socially inclined, not merely happier with company than without. It is an animal that is functionally incomplete outside of its social group. A lone wolf is not an independent wolf. It is an animal in a transitional state, either young and moving toward founding a new family, or older and having lost one, searching for connection. The lone state is temporary by design. The natural endpoint is family, and the wolf belongs to its territory in the same foundational way. The miles it has walked, the scent posts it has marked and remarked, the den site it returns to each spring. These are not just useful resources, they are home. The landscape is known at a level of depth that produces something very like attachment. Animals that are captured and relocated consistently attempt to return, sometimes successfully over remarkable distances. The pull of familiar territory is real and strong. Put these two things together, belonging to a family and belonging to a place, and you have the basic structure of a wolf's life. It is a life organized around connection. Not the dramatic, mythologized connection of howls in the dark and epic hunts across frozen tundra. Just the ordinary, daily, physical connection of warm bodies in the cold, and the comfort of knowing exactly where you are. On zzScience, we come back to this kind of quiet often. The unremarkable middle of wild lives, the hours between events, the sleeping bodies and the slow breathing and the familiar places. There's a reason it's calming, we think, not just because the images are peaceful, though they are, but because this kind of calm is something biological, something the nervous system recognizes. The image of animals at rest, surrounded by family, in a place they know completely. There's some part of the brain that receives that information and softens because it recognizes what it's seeing. Safety, belonging, rest. The wolf doesn't have a word for any of this. It doesn't need one. Let's spend a moment on something that's often framed as conflict, but is, actually, mostly, management. The relationship between wolf packs and their borders. Adjacent territories are common. Any landscape that can support one pack will usually support several, and the territories of neighboring packs share borders, edges that are marked and monitored from both sides. These borders are not permanent lines on a map. They shift with seasons and with the fortunes of each pack. A pack that loses members may contract its territory. A pack with a successful breeding season and many surviving pups may gradually expand. The borders move, but mostly packs stay on their side. The scent marking that maintains borders is essentially a communication system. Not aggressive, just informative. We are here. This territory is occupied. The pack that holds this land is active and present. A neighboring pack smelling fresh marks has no reason to cross into dangerous territory if its own territory is adequate. Conflict is expensive. Avoidance is cheaper. Open conflict between packs does happen. It's one of the leading causes of wolf mortality in areas with high pack density. When it happens, it can be serious. Wolves can inflict severe injuries on each other, and pack-on-pack encounters are among the genuinely dangerous situations in wolf life. But they're not constant. They're not every day. They're the edge cases, the breakdown of the communication system when something unusual forces packs into contact. The everyday border relationship is much quieter. A wolf approaches the edge of its territory, reads the scent posts, adds its own marks, turns around, goes home. The neighboring pack, traveling on its side, does the same. Two families maintaining the space between them through chemical communication, rarely meeting, rarely needing to. It's almost polite. Not because wolves are polite in any conscious sense, but because the system works better when everyone follows the protocol. One more thing about the family unit before we move into the sounds of the night. There is a documented behavior in wolves that researchers have spent some time thinking about, and it doesn't fit easily into the standard categories of animal behavior research. It happens most often after a pack member dies. Wolves, like dogs, show behavioral responses to the death of a pack member that suggest something is happening beyond simple absence. An animal that dies is often stayed with, the pack or individual pack members remaining near the body for a period, returning to it, sniffing it extensively. This has been observed multiple times in field studies. After a wolf dies, the remaining pack members may behave unusually for a period, traveling differently, calling more, showing disruptions to normal routine. We don't call this grief in wolf biology papers, not usually. Grief is a human word for a human experience. But something happens in the pack after a loss that changes the pack, and the behavior suggests that the absence of the lost animal is registered, is real to them, is a change in their world that they respond to. What that response is like from the inside, whether there is something like the ache of absence, the way a familiar sound stops and the silence is wrong, we don't know. We can't know. But it seems important to notice. It seems like something that belongs in any honest account of what wolves are. The night has settled fully now. The sky is clear. The storm that the air promised is holding off for another day. The Milky Way has come out overhead, that cold, crowded river of stars that you can actually see in dark places, the kind of sky that most people alive today have never experienced, but that every wolf alive has seen 100 times. not that they look up, not that it matters to them the way it would matter to us. What matters to them is closer. The smell of the animal sleeping against them, the slight rise and fall of a sibling's ribs, the warmth pooling between pressed bodies, the known and familiar. The pack sleeps. And somewhere, maybe miles away, from another pack's territory, there's a sound beginning. Low at first, rising. A wolf's voice carrying across the dark. Before we talk about the howl itself, let's stay in the quiet for just a moment longer. Because the quiet is where the howl comes from. It emerges out of silence the way all important sounds do, meaning something partly because of what surrounds it. A voice in a crowded room is noise. The same voice in an empty forest at midnight is something else entirely. The contrast matters. The silence that holds the sound gives it weight. And the forests where wolves live are, as we've been sitting with across these past hours, extraordinarily quiet. Not silent in the absolute sense. There's always something, the wind or the creak of wood, or the small sounds of small animals moving under the snow. But quiet in the way that matters. No industrial hum, no traffic, no human infrastructure bleeding sound into the landscape. Just the world making the sounds it makes when left to itself. Into that world, the howl arrives. You hear it before you understand what you're hearing. That's how it works, apparently, for people who have been in wild places and heard wolves for the first time. The brain doesn't immediately categorize it. It arrives as pure sound first. This long, rising, extraordinarily carrying tone, and then recognition catches up. A wolf. That's a wolf. And by the time recognition arrives, the sound has already done something to your nervous system that recognition can't undo. A slight lift in the chest, a sharpening of attention, something old and wired in responding before the conscious mind has a chance to frame it. People describe the feeling differently. Some say it's alarming, some say it's beautiful, some say it's neither of those exactly, that it's more like being reminded of something you forgot you knew. A feeling of the world being very large and very old, and you being very small within it, but not in a bad way. In the way that sometimes, when conditions are right, feels like relief. So what is the howl, biologically? What is it actually doing? The most important thing to understand about howling is that it is, at its core, a distance communication system. That's what it's for. Wolves need to maintain contact with pack members who may be miles away, and they need to do it without being physically present. The howl is the solution to that problem. It's a long-range message, a signal that carries information across space that the animal itself cannot cross quickly. The specific information carried in a howl is something researchers have spent significant time trying to decode with reasonable success. Individual wolves have recognizably different voices. The howl carries identity. A wolf that hears a howl from its territory can distinguish, at least with familiar individuals, whether the voice belongs to a pack member or a stranger. This is functionally important. The response to a packmate's call is different from the response to an unknown wolf's call. The first might trigger an answering howl and movement toward the sound. The second might trigger alertness, silence, a different kind of attention. Beyond identity, the howl seems to carry location information simply by virtue of direction and, to some degree, by characteristics of the call that shift with distance. A wolf trying to locate another wolf listens not just to whether a response comes, but to where it comes from, how far away it seems. The landscape acts as a transmission medium, and an animal with a very good auditory system, which wolves certainly have, can extract considerable spatial information from a sound, even over long distances. And the howl carries something else, something harder to quantify: emotional state. Researchers who have listened to enough wolf vocalizations describe being able to hear a difference between a wolf that is calling from a stable, secure situation and a wolf that is calling under stress. The calls of isolated wolves, animals that have lost contact with their pack, have been described as having a particular quality, a searching urgency that is different from the rounder, more settled calls of wolves calling from within a functional pack. Whether this difference is objectively measurable or partly in the ear of the trained observer is something still being worked out. But the sense that the calls are not emotionally neutral, that something of the animal's state is encoded in the sound, is persistent in the literature. The mechanics of how a wolf produces a howl are worth understanding because they explain, in part, why the sound carries so far. A wolf howling is not simply a wolf barking loudly. It's a fundamentally different vocal behavior, produced differently and designed for different purposes. When a wolf howls, it opens its mouth to a specific shape. The lips pulled back, the jaw angled, the throat open. That creates a resonating chamber designed to project sound at low frequencies over long distances. Low frequencies travel further than high frequencies in most environments, and the wolf's howl sits in a range, typically between 150 and 780 Hz, with the fundamental frequency usually in the lower part of that range, that is well suited to carrying through forest and over open terrain without being absorbed quickly by vegetation or topography. The duration of a single howl is typically 3 to 7 seconds, sometimes longer. And during that duration, the wolf is modulating the pitch, the classic rise and fall, or rise and sustain and then slow descent, that characterizes the sound most people can mentally reproduce when they think of it. That modulation is not purely aesthetic. It seems to pack more information into the call, creating a more complex signal that is harder to confuse with ambient sound and easier to localize. The volume at the source can be surprisingly high. Studies have recorded howls at close range at 90 to 115 decibels, which is substantial. At distance, that volume drops according to the physics of sound propagation. But even at several miles, a howl remains audible. In ideal conditions, cold, clear air, low wind, open terrain, a wolf's howl has been detected at distances exceeding 10 miles. In forest conditions with broken terrain, the range is shorter. But even in forest, a mile or two is routine. 10 miles. An animal calling to its family across 10 miles of dark, frozen landscape and being heard. There's something in that scale that's difficult to absorb. The vast territory we talked about in part 1, the hundreds of square miles that a pack might hold, suddenly makes sense acoustically. The voice is the thread connecting the dispersed members of the family across distances that their bodies cannot quickly cross. The howl is how you say, "I am here," when here is very far from where the others are. Let's think about hearing, because the wolf's auditory system deserves as much attention as its nose. Human hearing operates well in the range of roughly 20 to 20,000 Hz. Though in practice, most adults hear the upper end of that range much less well than the lower end, particularly after years of noise exposure. We're reasonably good listeners by primate standards, but by wolf standards, we're quite limited. Wolves can hear sounds up to approximately 40,000 Hz, more than double the upper limit of human hearing. This means they're picking up ultrasonic information, sounds in ranges that are simply absent from our experience, from the world around them. The high-frequency sounds made by small animals moving under snow, the particular sounds of different materials being compressed or scraped, sounds that our ears don't receive, and our brains therefore have no way to process or even notice. But the sheer frequency range isn't the most important part. More important is the directional sensitivity and the sensitivity to faint sounds. A wolf can detect sounds at lower intensities than a human can. It can locate the source of a sound with greater precision. The ears themselves, those large, upright, forward-facing ears that are so immediately recognizable in a wolf's silhouette, are mobile. They can rotate independently, each ear tracking different directions simultaneously, giving the brain a stereo picture of the sound environment that is richer than what our fixed outer ears can provide. Put a wolf in a forest, and it is receiving a continuous, detailed, high-resolution audio picture of everything within roughly a mile. Every movement, every sound of contact, compression, displacement. The mouse tunneling under the snow 20 meters away. The raven 200 meters off, shifting its weight on a branch. The distant creak of a tree stressed by wind. All of this is arriving, being processed, being evaluated and categorized and filed away or flagged for attention. The wolf sitting at rest, eyes half closed, head slightly lowered, looking to the human observer as though it's not doing much. That wolf is doing a great deal. Its ears are working continuously, turning and adjusting. Its nose is sampling the air on every breath. Its brain is taking all of this input and generating a comprehensive picture of its immediate environment that we, with our inferior sensory equipment, simply cannot access. The night forest has its own acoustic ecology. This is a term, acoustic ecology, that comes from environmental sound research, the study of how living and non-living things contribute to the soundscape of a place. Different habitats have different soundscapes, different mixes of sounds, different rhythms and textures of audio experience. A tropical rainforest sounds completely different from a boreal forest, which sounds different from an Arctic tundra. And within each of those habitats, the soundscape changes with season, time of day, weather. A boreal forest in deep winter at 2 in the morning has a particular soundscape that is, by most measures, about as minimal as any soundscape gets on land. The birds are mostly absent. Most songbirds have migrated, and the winter residents, the chickadees and nuthatches and woodpeckers, are roosted and silent through the coldest hours. The insects are gone entirely. The amphibians have been underground since October. The mammals that are still active, the wolves, the foxes, the weasels, the occasional moose, are mostly quiet as they move. What remains is the physical world making sound without biological assistance. Wind, ice, wood, the deep settling sounds of frozen ground, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere, contracting in the cold with a sound like a small gunshot. Far away, a frozen lake groaning as the ice sheet flexes. A sound that carries remarkable distances and that has been described by people who've heard it without warning as one of the stranger sounds in nature. Deep and resonant and slightly unnerving, like the landscape itself sighing. And occasionally, crossing this minimal soundscape, the howl. It arrives and the soundscape changes completely, just for those seconds. Everything that is in that frequency range, and the wolf's howl cuts right through the kinds of ambient masking that obscure other sounds, becomes dominant. And then it ends, and the quiet returns, and the quiet after a howl is somehow quieter than the quiet before it. The contrast effect. The silence that follows sound feels deeper than the silence that precedes it. Chorus howling is something different from a single wolf calling, and it's worth describing because it's one of the more acoustically remarkable things that happens in wolf territory. When a pack howls together, which they do regularly, and apparently not only in response to specific stimuli, but sometimes seemingly spontaneously, the way a human family might break into a familiar song without obvious reason. The sound that results is something that defies easy description. Multiple wolves, each with a different voice, sustaining and modulating their call, create a harmonic structure that is more complex than any individual call. The voices overlap and interfere with each other in ways that produce beating patterns, chord-like combinations, moments of accidental harmony, and moments of rough dissonance. One of the documented effects of chorus howling is that it produces an auditory illusion. A group of 5 wolves howling together sounds, to a listener trying to count voices, like more than 5 wolves. The overlapping frequencies and the complex intermodulation between individual calls creates the impression of a larger group than is actually present. This has been studied and confirmed in research. People and possibly other animals systematically overestimate the size of a howling group when multiple individuals are calling simultaneously. Whether this effect is intentional in any wolf cognitive sense, whether wolves use chorus howling in part because it makes them sound like more wolves than they are, is something that can't be definitively answered. But the effect is real, and it's the kind of effect that, if it reliably caused neighboring packs to overestimate a group's size and therefore be more cautious about approaching, would be favored by natural selection over time. The math works even without any conscious strategy. The experience of hearing a pack howl from close range has been described by researchers who've had that experience as one of the more physically overwhelming acoustic events in nature. Not loud in the rock concert sense, it's not damaging volume, but full, filling. The sound has a physical quality, particularly the lower harmonics, that you feel as well as hear. A resonance that moves through the body. People who have described it up close, in the field, consistently reach for words like overwhelming and primal and unlike anything else, and then seem a little frustrated that those words aren't quite right. Let me try to describe a specific sequence that researchers have documented and that captures something true about how howling actually functions in pack life. A pack of 6 wolves is resting at midday. They've been in place for a couple of hours. 2 of the adults were away from the rest overnight, traveling a long loop through the eastern edge of the territory, and rejoined the group this morning. Now everyone is together, resting in the comfortable stillness of midday winter. At some point, no obvious trigger, or at least no trigger obvious to the human observer watching from a distance, one wolf raises its head and begins to howl. Not the full volume, full effort howl of a wolf calling across miles. A quieter, more conversational version. Starting low, rising slowly. Before the first wolf has completed the first call, a second wolf is responding, and then a third. Within perhaps 15 seconds, all 6 wolves are howling simultaneously, each in their own key, their voices weaving around each other in that complex pattern. The sound rises, and then gradually, individually, the voices drop out, first one, then another, until only the original wolf is still calling, and then that voice too descends and stops. Silence. The pack sits or lies in that silence for a moment, and then, from somewhere to the east, far away, maybe 2 miles, maybe 3, an answering voice. A single wolf from the neighboring pack calling back. Short, 3 seconds. Then silence. The pack listens, ears up, heads turned toward the east. They don't call again. They've received the information they needed. The neighbor is over there, 2 or 3 miles away, present and accounted for. The border is intact. Everyone knows where everyone is. 2 minutes later, the pack has settled back into rest. The incident is over. Communication was exchanged across miles of winter forest. Information was updated, and now the pack sleeps. It took about 4 minutes total, and it was almost entirely quiet. There's a type of howling that has a different quality than the territorial contact calls, and it's the one that most immediately affects human observers. Researchers call it the lonesome howl, or sometimes the contact call of isolation. And it is what a wolf does when it has lost contact with its pack and is attempting to re-establish it. The isolated wolf howls differently. The calls are typically longer. There's more apparent urgency in the structure of the call, faster onset, more frequency modulation. The wolf may call repeatedly, with short pauses to listen for an extended period. And it listens intensely after each call, its whole body oriented toward the direction it's listening, waiting. If an answering call comes, the change in the isolated wolf's behavior is immediately visible. The tension in the posture releases. The wolf may wag its tail. It calls again, locates the direction of the pack by the response, and begins moving toward them. If no answer comes, the wolf calls again and again. The searching quality of the isolated wolf's call is the one that people find most affecting. It is clearly a call born of something, need maybe, or the specific discomfort of absence from familiar others. It has a particular timbre that is different from the rounder, more settled pack calls, and the difference is audible even to untrained human ears. Something in it that sounds, to us, like looking, like reaching. We're back to the language problem again. We can describe the behavior, but the interior experience is inaccessible. What the isolated wolf feels is not something we can know, but the behavior suggests a state that is not comfortable, not chosen, and from which the wolf is working hard to escape. And the relief, when the pack answers, is visible and behavioral and real. Let's talk about what wolves hear in the dark. A wolf lying in the snow at 3 in the morning, ears rotating slowly, is receiving information about its world at a level of detail that we simply can't reconstruct from the outside. But we can think about what the forest is offering. The wind, if there is any, moves through the trees and produces different sounds depending on the trees. The dry rattle of bare deciduous branches is different from the deeper, more sustained sighing of evergreen boughs with their dense needles. The wolf can hear not just wind, but the nature of what the wind is moving through, the texture of the forest canopy above it. Somewhere in the middle distance, a great grey owl is hunting. It flies silently. Owls are famous for their sound-damping feathers, the comb-like serrations on the leading edge of their flight feathers that break up the turbulence that would otherwise produce sound. The owl itself makes almost no sound in flight, but the wolf might hear the very slight disturbance of air, the minimal sound of a large body in motion, and certainly will hear the soft impact when the owl drops into snow after prey. Closer, the small sounds of the sub-Nivean world. The space between snow surface and ground that small mammals inhabit through winter. A world of tunnels and chambers and relative warmth, insulated above by snow. Voles and shrews move through this world constantly, and their movements produce faint sounds. The scratching of feet on compressed snow, the occasional squeak, that carry upward through the snowpack. A wolf lying on the snow surface is, in a sense, lying on the ceiling of a small mammal city. The city's sounds come up through the floor, much further away, maybe nothing. Or maybe, at the very edge of perceptible range, the faint sound of a river moving under ice, a low, continuous gurgling that, in the deep cold, is muffled but not silenced. Water moving, the world still moving under its frozen surface. And then, at whatever distance, on whatever schedule, the howl. There is a pattern in wolf communication that doesn't involve sound at all, and which happens mostly at dawn and dusk. It's sometimes called the group ceremony or the greeting ceremony, and it's worth describing because it's the moment of maximum social expressiveness in wolf life. At dawn, typically, after a night of intermittent rest, some animals may have traveled, others may have stayed in place. Pack members who have been separated through the night begin to reconvene. And when they meet, even after just a few hours of separation, there is a distinct ritual. The energy changes immediately. Bodies that were moving at the calm, purposeful trot lift into something faster, more buoyant. Tails come up. Vocalizations begin. The mix of yips and soft howls and lower rumbles that accompanies high social arousal. Animals run toward each other, and then run alongside each other, bodies bumping, muzzle licking happening quickly and repeatedly, tails wagging with that full body energy that, in dogs, we call wiggling. This lasts a few minutes, and then it resolves. The energy settles back to baseline. The pack orients collectively in some direction, sometimes seeming to reach a consensus about where they'll go, which may involve brief competing tugs, some animals moving one way and others another before the group coalesces, and they move out together. The ceremony is interesting because it seems disproportionate to the length of the separation. A few hours apart, and they greet each other as if returning from a long journey. But this might reflect something true about wolf psychology. Separation from the pack is always, at some level, a stress. Even brief separation. The reunion is worth celebrating because the reunion resolves something. The group is whole again. That matters. The routine of wolf life, when you follow it across a full year, has a rhythm that is both varied and deeply patterned. The seasons create different demands and different possibilities, and the pack adapts. But underneath the seasonal variation, the same things recur. Travel, rest, family, contact, communication, the maintenance of territory. These are the constants. The pack moves together. The pack rests together. The pack checks in with each other continuously through sound and scent and touch. The territory is known and marked and walked again. There is a word that ecologists use for animals that are well adapted to a particular habitat. They call them specialists. A wolf is a specialist in northern landscapes, in prey-rich ecosystems, in cold and snow, and the particular challenges of surviving in spaces that are, by human standards, quite inhospitable. But the wolf doesn't experience its habitat as inhospitable. The frozen ground and the deep cold and the vast quiet, these are not obstacles to wolf life. They are the medium of it. The wolf is built for exactly this. And so, what looks from the outside like hardship, the extreme cold, the long distances, the intermittent food, is, from the wolf's perspective, if we can carefully use that word, simply the world, the normal world, the world that smells like home and sounds like family and feels like the known landscape underfoot, even at 3 a.m, even in a storm. The comfort of that knowing is something real. Behavioral research consistently shows that animals in familiar environments show lower stress physiology than the same animals in unfamiliar environments. The home range is literally calming at a neurobiological level. The wolf in its territory, among its family, is in the state that its nervous system is designed for. Everything is familiar. The scent marks are its own. The sleeping bodies beside it are known. This is as close to peace as any living thing gets. One of the quieter observations from wolf field research, one that tends to not make it into the documentaries, is how much time wolves spend simply looking, not hunting, not traveling, not engaging in social behavior, just standing or sitting or lying and looking at the world around them, watching a raven circle, watching the far tree line, watching the surface of a frozen river, alert without apparent object, present without apparent purpose. It's very easy to anthropomorphize this, to project contemplation or wonder or some kind of animal meditation onto a wolf sitting and watching the world. And the honest answer is, we don't know what's happening in there. The wolf might be processing olfactory information that we can't perceive, building a picture of the environment from scent cues that require stillness and sustained attention. It might be in a drowsy, semi-alert state that just looks, from the outside, like watchfulness. It might be doing something we don't have a good framework for. But the behavior is real, and it recurs. Wolves sit and look at things, for minutes at a time, in no hurry. The world going on around them, and the wolf receiving it, and apparently in no rush to be anywhere else. There's something in that image. The wolf still on a hillside, amber, eyes moving slowly across the valley below. The wind moving through its thick fur, the world doing what it does. That is extremely restful to think about. Not dramatic, not fraught, just an animal in its place, doing the animal thing of being present to its surroundings. Let's think about what the forest sounds like just before dawn. This is the time of the morning that is technically still night, no light yet, or only the faintest suggestion of grey somewhere far at the eastern horizon. The temperature, which dropped steadily through the night, is at its lowest point. The cold is as complete as it will get. In these temperatures, the air itself has a quality that changes sound transmission slightly. Cold, dense air actually carries sound more efficiently than warm air. So the soundscape of pre-dawn extreme cold is, paradoxically, crisper and more detailed than the warmer hours. The wolf pack, which has been resting through the deep hours of the night, is beginning to stir. This is one of those activity peaks we mentioned, the crepuscular patterns that bring wolves to fuller alertness around the transition hours between day and night. An adult stretches, one of those full-body extensions that canids do, hindquarters up, forelegs extended, back arching. A long exhale, the steam of breath visible in the cold air. Another adult is already on its feet, standing at the edge of the resting site, nose up. Some information coming in on the air. The body posture says it's not alarming. The tail is level. The ears are up but not tense. The weight is evenly distributed. Just interesting. Something worth noting. A pup, one of last spring's litter, now a substantial young animal, but still clearly juvenile in its energy and the uncertain softness of its movements. Wakes and immediately, in the way of young things, wants to play. It approaches an adult, does the play bow, that specific posture with the 4 feet down, hindquarters up. That means unambiguously, I want to play. This is play. Whatever I do next is play. And gets a brief, patient response from the adult. Not much energy, not at this hour. A nose touch, a tail wag that says, acknowledgement without commitment. The pup accepts this and wanders off to investigate a smell near the base of a tree. The sky is lightening now, the grey at the horizon becoming visible. The stars, which were brilliant an hour ago, beginning to lose definition as the light increases from below. And then, from somewhere across the territory. Maybe the other adults who traveled earlier and are now returning, or maybe a response to some stimulus the resting wolves perceived before the observer did. A howl begins. It rises from somewhere a mile or two away, clear in the cold pre-dawn air, carrying across the frozen landscape with that particular quality that makes it unlike any other sound. 3 seconds. 4. Rising and then holding, and then slowly descending. The pack listens. The adult that was already on its feet has oriented toward the sound, ears fully forward. The pup has stopped its investigation of the tree base and is also listening, its head tilted in the way young animals tilt their heads at sounds they're still learning to interpret. A pause. And then the pack answers. One voice at first, then another, then the whole group together. That complex, layered chorus rising into the pre-dawn cold. The sound carries. Miles away, the wolves who had been calling hear the answer and know where home is, know which direction to move. The chorus lasts maybe 30 seconds. Then the forest is quiet again. The sky continues to lighten. The pack shakes out the last of the night's rest and begins to move, slowly, in the direction of the returning calls. Moving toward the sound of family. Moving through the known landscape at that easy, sustainable trot, paws coming down quietly in the snow, breath making small clouds in the cold air. The morning is very still. The trees are very old. The snow holds the light in the way snow does, not reflecting it exactly, more absorbing it and giving it back in a softer form, so that the whole landscape glows faintly in the growing dawn, from below as well as above. The wolves move through this light without hurry. This is something that zzScience comes back to in these long, slow journeys through the lives of animals. The idea that most of existence, for wolves, for most creatures, is not the dramatic part. It's the part between the dramatic parts. The long stretches of moving at a comfortable pace through familiar country. The midday rest in the sun. The easy social contact of family members who know each other completely. The reliable return of dawn and the reliable howl across the distance. And the reliable answering call that says, "We're here, we're coming." The forest this morning is doing what it does. The ravens, who have been roosted since dark, are beginning to move. One arrives at the edge of the clearing where the wolves had rested, and finds the impression in the snow where the bodies had been, and investigates it with the thorough, professional interest that ravens bring to everything. The impression is still faintly warm where the snow is slightly different, already disappearing. The wolves are gone from this spot, moving through the trees to the north, toward the returning voices. The snow holds the shapes of where they were. The cold holds the shape of the sound they made. And somewhere in the distance, the forest continues, and the pack moves through it. And the morning light comes slowly over everything, and the world is very large and very old and full of a quiet that goes on and on.